My name is Natalie, Lartey, and I've worked on food justice issues for quite a while, but mainly in what we call global south countries, not so much in the UK. So I'm particularly interested in the topic we've got today. What we're going to focus on is how this idea of holding UK food corporations accountable for past harms to both people and planet can be used to help us think about how we can transform UK food systems in the present. So, because we're going to do a little bit of that looking backwards, we're going to use a principle called Sankofa. Is there anyone in the audience who knows what Sankofa is? Or maybe anybody online? Yes, the lady at the back in the middle with the black.
I understand it comes from a bird living from West Africa.
Yeah.
Who, as it runs forwards, it looks back. And so it's the idea that in order to go forward, you need to look back.
Exactly that. So it's a symbol from Ghana. And it is represented by a bird that has its feet in one direction and its head facing the other. And it literally means to go back and retrieve. It's used by Ghanaians, but also people all over the world, to really kind of take a practice into daily life where you're really committed to learning from the past in order to grow and develop a successful future. So when we think about food corporations from Britain and we think about past harms that have been done and we want to explore those, we automatically find ourselves thinking about harms that have been done to Black and Indigenous people and people of colour as a result of the transatlantic slave trade. In that process, we had people who were food producers as well as consumers all experiencing quite extreme harm. You know, people being trafficked, people experiencing forced violence. We hear a lot of that side of the narrative, but what we hear less of is the fact that they were experiencing these things in order to plant crops, to irrigate, to fertilise and to harvest. You know, things like ginger, other spices, cassava, and most obviously sugarcane. So in our session today, we'll be looking back at some of those past harms and trying to think, what is it that we can learn from those experiences in order to help us in transforming UK food corporations for some of the more contemporary struggles that we are facing in relation to them. We're looking at the word reparations quite broadly. We're thinking about redistribution, but we're also thinking about recognition. Yeah, we're thinking about repairing broadly. How do we recognise these past injustices, and how do we recognise the very different types of knowledge that might be needed to really understand them, reconcile with them, and then move forward thinking about how to transform the future. So we have three amazing speakers for this session. They've all walked very different paths, and so they're going to share their ideas on reparations and UK food corporations in quite unique ways. We'll have some music, we'll have some observations from both research and practice. Now, we will talk about race and racism, and when you do that, it can be uncomfortable sometimes. I just want to flag that early on. If you find yourself feeling discomfort through the discussion, I just really encourage you to be curious about that. Try not to react to it, but just lean into it with curiosity, because often what we find is underneath that curiosity, there'll be some insight. And the discomfort is really just a red flag to say, look here, there's something to learn and understand. So going back into that harm and getting uncomfortable is really about learning and curiosity and discovery. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speakers. I will have to read from my laptop, so please bear with me for a moment. So to my left, we have Kpodonu. Andre has an MA in Applied Anthropology and Youth Work, and over decades of experience supporting youth-led action in communities grappling with marginalisation and structural disadvantage. He is head of activism at Feedback Global, where he leads on broadening and deepening participation in the organisation's work to transform our food system. Andre directs Feedback's work on reparations, and his pronouns are he, him. We also have Laurie, otherwise known as Laurie Mompelat. Her pronouns are they, them. Laurie is a local food justice organiser in the climate justice movement, and she works for Platform. Laurie is also an award-winning sound maker and singer-songwriter from the Caribbean, whose craft is inspired by climate grief, but also decolonial healing and community-led resistance in their homelands of Guadeloupe and Martinique. As an independent artist, they're currently working on their first trilogy of EPs, one of which is entitled Portals of Return. And Laurie will be sharing some of the extracts from her recent body of work today. Lastly, Sorry, they are sharing with us today some extracts from this body of work. Lastly, we have Tom Wakeford. Tom is a member of Etc. Collective, an international community civil society organisation, using participatory methods to do action research on food sovereignty and democratic control of technology. Over the last 30 years, Tom's research and activism have covered areas such as anti-racism and climate justice. His books include Science for the Earth, Liaisons of Life, and Participatory Action Research, Escaping the White-Walled Labyrinth, which includes reflections on relationships between research, activism, and white male privilege. So thank you so much to our panellists. I'd like to start with you, Andre. We've heard a little bit about the topic. I'd like you to maybe give us some specific examples of situations where there have been racialised oppression from a UK food corporation, and tell us a little bit about why reparations might be needed.
Well, I think the classic example might be an organisation like Tate & Lyle, who has long and deep roots within the kind of globalised trade of commodities, including sugar. I think part of the rationale of this body of work, though, is that those narratives and those stories are just not present enough. We don't know enough, and it's slightly shocking, actually, at the disjointed nature of the narratives and the stories that we have around the culpability of our current kind of suite of industrial actors within the food system, and how much of their current existence can really be put down to the historical abuses that I think many of us are aware of. So I think my starting position is always that whatever I know, it's not even remotely close to enough, and that picture is nowhere near as complete as it should be. And I think that's kind of the burning question. It's the how do we pursue that? And I think I'll talk about in presentation that there's the work, part of what I and fellow partners and colleagues will be trying to do is to reveal the ways in which historical oppression serves as one of the base units for future environmental destruction and human rights abuses. In that that historical track record of industrial production within our food system serves to produce future atrocities, future things for us to be incredibly mad about.
And so, once we have this picture, it'd be great if you could share just a few of your slides and your thoughts on the topic more broadly.
Mm-hmm. Want to?
Yeah.
Should I
go ahead. Yeah.
All right. Let's get this party on the road. It's a very specific type of party. So, hi everyone. Here to talk to you about current thoughts on seeding reparations, beginning the movement, beginning the analysis. And these are thoughts. I tend to present with the view that I am a learning, living individual. I retain the right to change my mind or for these perspectives to develop. And what I'm trying to do is to inspire and encourage others to join people on this quest for new narratives and new ways of seeing things. I'm going to start with a story about a family called Baring. And this is the Baring family tree. Has anybody here heard of the Barings before? Okay, we've got one person. Two? Any others? Okay, so most notable, I think, in the contemporary age for the Barings Bank. It folded in, I think, 94, 95, after fraudulent activity by an employee by the name of Nick Leeson. It was then sold on to ING Bank for £1, and has since been kind of repackaged and sold up a few times, I think. But what I want to talk about is this kind of this history that's kind of built into there. I'm not a historian. I'm not gonna like bombard you with too many facts. I'm just gonna kind of point and show what I think I know. All right, and you'll note that this is a family tree from Wikipedia, right? So I'm kind of wearing my historical kind of nous on my sleeve here. So we got the main protagonist, I believe, is Sir Francis Baring. Okay, the one where it all begins. He's the son of a German immigrant to the UK. Doesn't appear to have much of a, there wasn't much in his early life that indicated that he would go on to have such a profound impact on the world that we currently see today. But eventually, kind of graduated from his apprenticeship in trading, started up along with his two other brothers, John Baring and Charles Baring, a network of merchant banks. Somewhere along the line, they kind of came together and formed Baring Brothers and Co. And amongst their greatest works, so Francis Baring had a directorship on the East India Trading Company. He was eventually granted a baronetcy, or a baronetcy, which I think is slightly less than a baronship. I don't really know. He then went on to, along with one of his mercantile correspondent houses, facilitate the Louisiana Purchase in the United States. So this was like an absolutely massive purchase of land, which doubled the land mass of the United States of America. And kind of from there, the Baring name seemed to just jump about history into momentous times. It's kind of remarkable. It's slightly like Back to the Future-esque, the way that it just pops up here and there. Kind of financing wars in the Americas. What else was happening? One of his descendants becomes Viceroy of India during the British Raj. Oversees the response to the Bihar famine. Also works to suppress, I think is probably an accurate word, an agrarian revolt that was taking place in the Bengal region. Fast forward, we get down to here. Here. Francis Baring. There's a conflagration of Francises in this family tree. It can get quite confusing, right? So the 6th Baron of Northbrook currently sits as one of the hereditary peers inside of the House of Lords. Still around today. Has 2 farms, which I believe are tenant farms. And, look, had a quick skim of his record. Doesn't look like he's a terrible individual or anything. I'm not sat here. But I think the point is that there is just this absolutely gigantic web of involvement in the formation of our industrial food system, and also in colonial webs of power. So that's one way that we would normally tell the story, right? And I think it's quite familiar in terms of reparations. What we're talking about here is like nefarious individuals or families, and who rise to fame and crash down in ignominy and all the rest of it. But I think there's a different way of telling that story, which I think centres reparation and centres how we move beyond, and like the role that reparation has in our fight for environmental justice. So this is a map of the world in 1840. Don't know why I picked that date. I just thought goodish one. So if we talk about the things that we've talked about so far, East India Trading Company over here, right? So it's going over there. I forgot to mention, sorry, that they were also beneficiaries. The Baring brothers were also beneficiaries of the Slavery Compensation Act in 1937, and had been mortgaging slaves in America. And so, you've firstly got genocide taking place in the Americas to clear lands. Then you have people imported from Western Africa, forced to work inside of those lands. Then kind of somewhere along the line, the narrative changes, slavery is no longer acceptable, at least in the UK, which stopped some activity. But what a lot of people don't realise is that there was then a second wave of mass migration, which is often derogatory called coolieism, which was essentially indentured labourers from India and China being shipped into the New World under contracts that were incredibly harmful and unfair. You've also got the British Raj at the time, so a bit of an economic transition took place in America. Cotton supplanted sugar, and so all of a sudden, England, who uses cotton uses the raw product and manufactures cotton cloth, decides that southern planters have too much power, and so starts to force the production of cotton as a commodity, as well as other food products, in order to drive down the price of American cotton, which completely disrupts the food economy in India, and through successive waves of famines. I think Mike Davis estimates about 30 million people died in the British Raj as a result of famines. When you tell a story like that in this kind of different way, I think some different structural elements. How am I doing for time? 3 minutes? Okay. A different story emerges. Rather than the kind of villainous family, instead what we begin to see is that each layer of oppression, or each epoch where some harm was done, results then in the creation of some of the bare materials that are needed for future waves of oppression, right? The descendants of enslaved Africans provided the kind of geographies in which sorry, I'm just a bit conscious of time and I don't want to get too far into it, but in the south, so for instance, I would encourage everyone to take a look at this study done by Forensic Architecture, and what it traces is that from the liberation of enslaved Africans in Louisiana, incidentally, the place that was purchased with the help of the Barings, you end up then with these people denied their full rights, which then enables the placement of harmful industry in certain areas because these people are subhuman. The territories that they inhabit become subhuman or become less important. And then you have petrochemical companies then coming in, polluting. These colours here are streams of pollutants. And it's really interesting. There are kind of a mixture of majority black and white neighbourhoods in this area. And the white neighbourhoods manage to fight vociferously to not have these polluting industries in their neighbourhoods. But when you look at models of the pollution streams, it blows over their places anyway. It doesn't and I think there's something just so interesting and important about this kind of understanding that the creation of people who, for whom their oppression is palatable, is one of the foundations by which all of our lives and all nature is being destroyed. It's very hard. I'm not sure where you could place a dirty factory spewing chemicals if everybody's lives were valued equally. Who would accept it in their neighborhood? Who wouldn't? And so there's something really important about this kind of understanding that the oppression is not just an aberration of morals, it's productive. It creates the foundations of future overexploitation of resources. I was talking to my partner last night, just kind of rambling about all of this stuff, and she's like, I've just done my fire safety training, and it really reminds me of this, all right? And so like, does like, this kind of model here, this diagram is all about, okay, there's a fire, right? There's 3 basic components that are needed in a fire. In order to put out the fire, you have to get rid of at least one of them, all right? Okay, so you've got oxygen, heat, fuel, all right? This is, I guess, raging capitalism. All right, we're gonna get there. So, and my view is that when you begin to analyze history and really look for these kind of, you know, the picture of how domination and exploitation accumulates, you begin to see this picture that when you've got structural domination embedded within a society, a territory, or geography, there are narratives that enable it, which enable it to claim that there is some sort of default right that inhabits, and disposable people and territories, or geographies, or natural resources, you end up with this fire of destruction, and it requires all 3. Now we're at a point where the fire is raging, and there is this sense of urgency which we all rightly feel, and I think it's incredibly important that we do focus on putting out the fire. The quickest solution is to find which one of these we can take out to quit that fire, right? But the point is, you know, reparations are important because what it seeks to acknowledge is that as long as 2 of these are still in place, all it takes is the wrong conditions to reignite that flame. All right, we could get rid of our understanding of biological racism, only for it to rear its head again in cultural forms, in structural forms. And I think we face the same challenge today. There is a lot of discussion about industrial processes and the ways in which we produce food. And yes, there is the opportunity to quell some particular processes. But as long as disposable people and territories exist, as long as there's structural domination, you know, as long as there's enabling narratives that allow the other 2 to exist, there's a risk. And so reparations really needs to be an organising narrative, an organising principle for how we deal with this. These vulnerabilities need to be repaired. They can't be left to sustain themselves. Senior Reparations is a new project, it's relatively new, less than 6 months old. We will be embarking on a journey to try and uncover more narratives and to think about how we pursue these ideas, these perspectives in the coming years. If you would be interested in following our progress or in directly being involved in understanding these narratives, please sign up to the newsletter and we'll be in touch soon. We're particularly interested in thinking about how policy organisations and people of colour can really unite, and grassroots racial justice organisations can really unite in that analysis alone. So please do follow on the journey, and yeah, I'm going to shut up because I probably over-talked. Thank you.
Thank you, Andre. I think there's something really interesting in Andre's observations about patterns and patterns of harm. And I think it will be really useful to think about that connection between the pattern that racial oppression leaves and the pattern that environmental injustice then walks in alongside it and after it. There is research and activists at the moment who are tracking those worst affected by racial and colonial oppression through that era and those worst affected by climate breakdown. And they're realising that the 2 are starting to mirror each other. It really speaks to Andre's points. So, without further ado, We are going to have some music. As I said, our speakers are going to be sharing their insights in different ways. So, Laurie, I wanted to ask you a little bit about the songs you're going to play for us. Maybe tell us a little bit about them and why you've chosen to perform them for us as part of this panel.
Yeah, of course. Hi, everyone. I really enjoyed that you mentioned Sankofa as a concept at the beginning, because I feel like these songs in various ways were my own way of processing my own Sankofa at a time of having left these islands, come to get a degree, an education, and start a life in the West, and realizing actually that I had been caught up in this narrative that these places that I come from are not doing anything for themselves when it comes to resisting capitalism, resisting colonialism. I come from islands that have been colonized by the French and are still under French ruling today. And I realized during the pandemic, actually, through quite a random process, I became aware of an environmental scandal that is ongoing in my home islands. And I became aware for the first time of the depth and beauty of community resistance that is present in these places that I come from. And I felt stupid, actually, for having been, I guess, conditioned into thinking that, internalizing that people from former colonies and people from the global South are waiting to receive reparations, are waiting to receive compensation, are waiting to receive solutions from the West. And it was really healing for me to realize that a lot of people my age who have never left are organizing for reparations, are repairing, in various different ways. And tuning to that, got my driving license, found a way to go back and spend time there. I just let myself, I guess, process what that meant for my worldview, how it shifted this sense of we need to be done begging for reparations. We need to start embodying it and claiming it and nourishing our sense of entitlement to a future that no longer regards Black people, brown people, colonized people as disposable. And so that's what I guess these songs are about in various ways. And the first one I'm going to perform for you is called L'amour. It's from an EP called Sound Capsule for Grieving, and it speaks to, it's in Creole, and it speaks to, after all of this taking and taking and taking and exhausting and sucking life out of land and bodies, how can we reconnect with the heart's infinite ability to regenerate and reconnect with this sense of okay, life is endless and we need to tune into that vibration to keep leaning into the work from this self-loving, sacred place. So I'm just going to share that with you. And then I'm going to share with you another song that's called Done Begging. So I'm going to play from the laptop. Yo point tout ça, yo te paie. Yo point tout ça, yo te paie. Mais yo peut pas tirer l'amour qui enchaîne nous. Mais yo peut pas tirer l'amour qui enchaîne nous. Souris, 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 et puis l'homme souris, et puis l'homme. Faut ça vous pégoumer, puis ça. L'amour qui enchaîne. Faut ça vous plie fort, et puis ça. Oh,
écouter l'amour qui enchaîne.
Thank you. And I'm going to share with you a second song. Thank you for receiving that. That second song is called Done Begging, and it speaks to that shift in posture, I guess, from we need more rights, we need more people to have access to the privileges that the society affords to the right kind of people, from a posture that is more about actually how can we reclaim our humanness and stand from that place of we need freedom. Freedom is slightly different from accessing privilege. And what does that mean, you know? That's what it's about.
I'm done begging, begging. Let me embody
The magic that will keep slipping through your fingers. The magic that will keep slipping through your fingers until you free yourself too. Give me rights, or give yourself freedom. Give me rights, or give yourself freedom. I do not want your privilege. I do not want your privilege. I do not want your privilege. I want both of us to be free. Give me rights, or give yourself freedom. Give me rights, or give yourself freedom. Take a left turn into our portal, into our portal, into our portal, so you can understand that there was never a right direction to start with. Give me rights, oh, give yourself freedom. Give me rights, oh, give yourself freedom. We are done begging, done begging, done begging. Well, let us be done begging, done begging, done. Give me rights, oh, give yourself freedom. I do not want your privilege. I do not want your privilege. I do not want your privilege. I want both of us to be free. Thank you.
So Laurie, they were really powerful songs. I'm sure you all agree. Can we have another round of applause for Laurie? I mean, your singing was so evocative. You know, I felt for a moment like I was transported back in time. Like we're here talking about Sankofa, and it's a bit like my head was one way and my legs were the other myself. There was something really powerful about that. It shifted me in time, and it's just making me wonder a little bit about, you know, can you connect with maybe thoughts or ideas about how people in the past may have wanted to address some of these issues we're dealing with? You know, do you get a sense of maybe why understanding ancestral or older practices is important? Can it really help us as we try to work through what type of transformation UK food corporations need?
I think it's happening actually, in fact, and like what I witness of decolonial movements in like Martinique, there's like in the context of that environmental scandal that I mentioned earlier, which is basically a pesticide called Kpodonu, I think in English, and like related pesticide, got allowed to be used in these places, even though they were forbidden and known to be carcinogenic internationally. But there was a decision made by the French state under the pressure of former planters who today are basically, they are the lobby who own the food system, most of it, the supermarkets, most of the land in Martinique and Guadeloupe. So under the pressure of this lobby, the French government accepted to allow the ongoing use of these pesticides on these lands, which obviously has had like devastating consequences on the land and for people. 95% of the population today has the pesticide in their blood, and we have world records of like prostate cancers and various other pathologies. And there's an immense amount of grief that comes with uncovering not only the reality of like what has been done to the land and the people and the workers, but also the decision that was made to prioritize profit making at the expense of people's life, but also the land. And I guess people understanding in that moment, people in the Caribbean who are like mostly descendants of enslaved workers, feeling in their blood again, this harm to the land is the harm in our flesh as well. That was the colonial regime, that was the enslavement regime. The land was being extracted from at the same time that labor was sucked out of these bodies and these humans. And I think what has been, alongside the grief, what has really given me hope and what's made me feel like writing music and finding ways of amplifying like this energy is finding how incredibly resilient and creative people become in these moments of just like, we're not going to wait for the French state to acknowledge the harm done and to do something about it. The French state has recently ruled an inconclusive case, so there's going to be no accountability. The archives that would have been, you know, necessary to incriminate the government members who made these decisions and the planters who use these pesticides, the archives have disappeared. And people are not going to sit around waiting for things to change. So people are starting to build alternative food system, like finding ways of doing community farming, despite the land having been poisoned, figuring out ways to cleansing the land, food co-ops being set up, and a lot of people my age who are all over the diaspora returning to homelands to figure out ways of contributing and to participate in what is essentially our own version of a just transition away from that harm. And within that, spirituality has been a huge component of how people finding and practicing reparation, like at the scale of the body, at the scale of how we relate with each other, and how we, I guess, like reigniting the sense of dignity in our ability to resist this structural harm that we understand has been there for so long and will keep coming. But there is something incredibly powerful in like finding the purpose in we're not just gonna wait for essentially like colonial powers to right these wrongs. We're gonna do it for ourselves. We're gonna be reparations, and reparations is happening, and it's just like we'll see who joins, you know. But like this sense of, and I feel like a lot of people have been drawing insights from. From I guess like ancestral knowledges around like, because other practices of caring for the land have been there for a long time, right? Like before the land was exploited with this very capitalist logic, there was all sorts of indigenous knowledge and ways of practicing intimacy with the land that people have to come back to, you know, permaculture markets like led by Black people, and like how that gathers families, and like the beauty of that has been, is both incredibly touching and nourishing, but also incredibly relevant to you know, to, and in that sense that like, it's not new, you know, like organic, you know, organic farming or whatever, it's not new. Like before colonialism was there, the way indigenous people cultivated their land and some of the knowledges from enslaved Africans that was brought to the land is actually the remedy, the medicine that today's land needs. And so yeah.
Thank you, thank you. There's a picture building here. You know, we've heard from Andre that some of the worst harms that have happened through food production and consumption have been these gateways to other forms of oppression. And we have that kind of repeating of history happening. You know, Laurie has taught us a little bit here about the importance of being part of a reparations movement and really thinking about repair and everyone having a part to play in that, but also everyone being able to benefit from it. If you're repairing for one group, then that actually brings some type of emancipation for a much wider set of people. And I'm just wondering, Tom, I think I'd like to come to you now. You know, we've seen these patterns, we've explored a little bit of what reparations could mean when expressed in its fullest sense. And I'm wondering, how did these approaches reconcile themselves with some of the more classic and traditional approaches that are currently being taken to transforming UK food corporations, and particularly this approach where we are thinking about technology and large-scale action? Are there fits? Can any of this come together? It'd be great if you could share your thoughts.
Thanks, yeah. So at Etc, we monitor technologies, particularly corporate-controlled technologies, as they affect food systems, and we're delighted to be part of seeding reparations alongside Feedback Global. And the image you brought to us, Natalie, of Sankofa, I think is so useful here, because we do need to look back in order to look ahead at what the corporations are doing, because as Andre pointed out, and we've heard through song and really sort of heart-rending music from Laurie, that they are very much the product of a history. So the other thing that in sort of chats prior to this, Natalie's brought to this discussion, which I found really helpful, is part of reparatory justice is actually a recognition justice. You have to recognise what's gone on, what's going on, and I want us to recognise the intersection we all have with the justice we're discussing. And so I want us to start with a look back over our shoulders, and as a help I'm going to look over my shoulder as someone who's been banging on about organic farming, to turn a phrase, since he was a child growing up on a rapidly industrialising farmland in the 1980s. So I just want to recall a radical time when some of us here in the UK came together and took direct action in support of Mother Earth. Seeing our children and grandchildren's environment being destroyed, this group formed a new organisation to do something about it. Their manifesto highlighted how conventional democratic politics was failing our environment. Politicians could not be trusted. We needed, these people believed, to get politics, to get beyond politics and beyond politicians. What was needed was something new, something truly radical. They created a cool logo. They held meetings, first in private, then increasingly in public. To join the group, you had to subscribe to a certain set of beliefs. The defence of the environment, of truly British agriculture and agricultural workers was among these beliefs. We needed more farmers, not less. More farmers, better food, you might say. So was the belief that politicians had failed. This was a movement beyond democratic politics. A leader emerged. This was a man who identified global capitalism as a key part of the problem. A large number of women, many of them feminists, were involved too. Their leaders agreed it was time to take their message to the streets. They dreamt up cool outfits. There were designers involved. Their cool logo was a circle with straight lines inside that looked a bit like a lightning bolt. Many of the leaders were convinced that people from a particular social group, people who all belonged to a single ancient religion, that they were part of the problem. Members of this religion were part of a global financial trading elite that was the heart of the environmental crisis. Do you see where I'm going here? You've probably worked out, I'm talking about a particular period of British history. The members of this religion were labelled moneylenders, speculators, and supposedly preyed on honest, indigenous people of Britain, including farmers, and these people were Jews. The group that took to the streets on the 4th of October 1936, the streets of London, were the British Union of Fascists, led by the aristocrat, the former Member of Parliament and 6th Baronet, Sir Oswald Mosley. Estimates of the numbers vary, but it's clear that at least 2,000 fascists marched behind Mosley from Tower Hill in London towards the East End, which was where most of London's Jewish community then lived. 6,000 police were deployed to protect their right to protest. The police defended their right to protest. In one of the seminal moments of political history, however, known as the Battle of Cable Street, at least 100,000 anti-fascists, women, men, children, from socialist, communist and other left movements confronted them. For me, growing up in a converted barn in rural Lancashire, 1936 meant nothing of that. It was just the year my dad was born. The reason I'm telling you this is because the person who was key in writing the agricultural policies of the British Union of Fascists, and the person who undertook much of its fundraising through garden parties and village fetes, was a farmer called Joran Jenks. Jenks was a graduate of both Harper Adams and Oxford universities, and he was later involved in establishing an organisation that has been a sponsor of this conference, ORFC, for many years. I think since the conference began, since this conference began, Jenks edited the organisation's newsletter called Mother Earth from its inception in 1946 and until he died in 1963. In 2021, this sponsor, the publisher of Mother Earth, published a commemorative edition of the magazine with a small paragraph acknowledging Jenks's links to Nazi ideology, which it linked to the philosophy of organicism. It ended with the following sentence: "Following a summer where the Black Lives Matter movement took centre stage, and in the year of our 75th anniversary, there's never been a better time to confront the ways organicist thinking raises uncomfortable questions of race and belonging." We might want to ask whether a better time might have been 75 years ago, or even 50 years ago, as the National Front and other fascist groups organised in the name of blood and soil. I might ask whether there was any connection with my own experience of environmentalism as a teenager, right up until I started working with anti-racist activists in my early 30s, why there was no connection in that time made in the mainstream environmental movement about racism. But let's fast forward a few years. It's 2018. Two charismatic white Britons, a man and a woman, have become figureheads of a movement in defence of the future environment to be inherited by their children and grandchildren. One of their 3 slogans is to be beyond politics. Spokespeople said that politicians had failed and that future policies should be determined by citizens' assemblies. They make a cool logo. They block the streets. As a movement, initially at least, it had nothing to say about racism and being anti-racist. Being arrested by the British police as a white person carries a very different risk to being arrested as a black or brown person. I went with some anti-racist activists to discuss some of this group's leaders about what could be so urgent about addressing environmental catastrophe that it could set aside issues of white supremacy. These activists and I as an observer was told there just wasn't time to talk about racism. We have to stop the planet burning first, they said. So in the spirit of Sankofa, we do need to retrieve these histories, all too easily forgotten, to create a better future. And because I was in universities for 20 years, I just want to share one other brief account. I worked at a university for 4 years, which set up a centre, which includes many values that many of us here hold dear. It upholds agroecological values. And at the same time, the university that hosted this centre decided to enforce the racist immigration policies of the UK Home Office, known as the hostile environment. So the reason I mention this is because people look to universities as beacons of critical thinking, places that there's freedom to speak truth to power. But what good is academic freedom, even on issues as urgent as agroecology, if it takes place within the gilded cage of white supremacy? So that's why I think that sort of recognition justice is important. While it's important to recognise these transnational corporations that I'm about to talk about in more detail, we would carry much more credibility, and I thank Natalie for leading me to this particular way of phrasing it, if we look critically at the mistakes that have been made within our own movements, and I include myself in this, in the past, before we criticise corporations. As part of the anti-GMO movement in the 1990s, I got a shock when I read Donna Haraway's critiques about the way the anti-GMO activists were using the idea of purity and impurity. It's a mistake, writes Donna Haraway, in this context, to forget that anxieties over the pollution of lineages is at the origin of racist discourse in European cultures. So now to the other way of answering the question about what are the corporations doing now? So I had the dubious pleasure of spending 3 weeks at the Conference of the Parties on Biodiversity just before the new year. And I just want to break it down into 3 areas and use Andre's really helpful, Andre's partner's really helpful triangle to just give due credit to build on that. So 3 Gs, genetic material, geoengineering and geography. So the ways in which the corporations are taking hold as they relate to genetic materials. So we've all heard that GM foods are still going to feed the world, apparently. This argument has mutated somewhat with new GM technologies, narratives of they're needed to address climate change, we need climate smart agriculture, and also apparently new genetic technologies are going to cure malaria in Africa, but what's actually happening with these new genetic technologies, and the particular technology, CRISPR-Cas9, won 2 people the Nobel Prize. And Jennifer Doudna, who's one of the prize winners, pointed out very soon after this technique had been developed that actually the main application for this rapid way of doing genetic engineering, it's just what genetic engineers have done for decades, but it just makes it quicker and cheaper, will be for agriculture. She said, yeah, of course, there'll be a lot of focus on the health benefits, but it's for basically making, helping the need to be less farmers involved in any form of agriculture, and for agroecology to be made as efficient as possible with precision genetics, allowing precision chemicals to be added. So what it doesn't do, thinking of the triangle there, is address the structural inequality. In fact, could we get the triangle up on the screen? It doesn't address the structural inequalities side of the triangle, and in terms of these genetics going wrong, thank you, it effectively, as you experiment with these new genetic technologies, has been so disastrous in the era of GM crops, it's treating people and territories as disposable, and the narratives we've heard. So that's genetic materials. Geoengineering, I don't know how much people have come across that term. Maybe it's been more in terms of hearing about techno fixes for climate, but really geoengineering is a term for any large-scale intervention to control the climate, to engineer the climate. And that was very prominent in Montreal as well, as it was in the COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. Large corporations saying, don't worry, we've got technologies to sort this out. We as John Kerry said before the Glasgow COP, the special envoy of the US government, half the technologies, half the reductions in carbon emissions rely on technologies that don't exist yet, but don't worry, leave it to corporations who are developing them. So these technologies are all being experimented over land of smallholders and indigenous peoples at the moment. In fact, there's an experiment been going on in Mexico over the Christmas and New Year, which is like sneakier than any of us imagined would happen. And of course, they don't address the structural inequalities, including racial inequalities. In fact, they make them worse. And then the final G of geography. Perhaps the biggest shock to many in Montreal, though there had been signals that it would happen, was the arrival of Jeff Bezos, who had recently been interviewed saying that the Earth should just become like a huge national park and should be left to peoples that knew what they were doing to sort of manage it, and the rest of us would take off into space. And he didn't turn up himself. Maybe he was preparing his spaceship, but he did send the head of, I can't remember what it's called, Earth Fund, Bezos Fund, something. And they have a plan. I mean, you're all laughing, but it is the 30 by 30 pledge that many, many NGOs, many of which represented here, are absolutely wedded to, that we just need to make sure 30% of the Earth's surface is protected by 2030, just not far away at all. And the way Jeff Bezos is doing that is actually buying it. And he will look after indigenous people's rights, smallholder farmers' rights, and they will look after it. And that is signed up to by probably nations, certainly that I belong to, anybody in the EU, Brazil, like a vast majority of countries signed up to 30 by 30.
He is.
Jeff Bezos is, the billionaire behind Amazon. Thank you very much. So yeah, and so at a protest that some brave protesters broke through a cordon and stood in front of Bezos, and they had a sign saying, "The wrong Amazon is burning." So this isn't just history, this is happening right now, but I'm really glad this has been put in historical context. But these corporations, Amazon, Microsoft behind the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, who are pushing so much of these dangerous genetic technologies, the Agra plan in Africa, and the companies, again, Microsoft, again, big oil companies, of course, that are the elephant in the room behind anything to do with geoengineering, because, of course, if they say these technologies can be invented, they can keep drilling for oil, they all need to be held to account as they should be tracing backwards.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm mindful of time. Before we go to questions, I would like to thank you, Tom, for sharing such a kind of personal reflection on some of your own journey with us all. So thank you for that. Could we maybe go online first with questions, just to see if we have colleagues who are watching online that have a couple of questions? Maybe if I give you a minute to get that up, Morgan, I'll take one from the floor, then we'll come to you. First question from the floor, please. Gentleman in the orange jumper.
Yeah. Any white person opening their mouth. I'm aware as a baby boomer whose first sentence I completed copying off the board in 1954 was, "Today is Empire Day," that my brain is not sort of completely clear on these issues. And I remember the words of Upton Sinclair, which goes along the lines of, "It's difficult to get a man to understand something if his salary depends on not understanding it." And I'm thinking about the optimal strategies for people, to get people particularly in my demographic to engage with these extremely uncomfortable issues. 2 or 3 years ago, a cousin of mine who's on one side of her family was rather proudly descended from the owners of a very liberal mill, discovered that they actually owned plantations in Southern America as well, and the money that paid for her and her brother's public school fees back in the 50s and 60s was probably came from, what was it, the 1837 Slaving Compensation Act. Now, how far you follow this up in detail, who pays who what, or whether you simply use this as a challenge for exploration, might increase or reduce people's sort of anxiety or the tractability for change. I mean, so many good points here. I won't bore you all by repeating them, but that's about as much as time as I'm entitled to at the moment, I think.
Andre, do you want to take this
Yeah,
one?
I was, your question reminded me of, I was reading Mike Davis's, what's the book called? It's called El Nino. It will come back to me. But essentially, within the book, the example of the kind of famines in India, one of the things that he draws attention to was that the Great Famine, which happened around the turn to the 20th century, was happening concurrently with the Boer War. And Britain found out something really interesting there, that the level of malnourishment that working people in Britain was subject to was so stark that Britain nearly lost the war. And so actually it was one of the major drivers for increasing food access within the UK. There was this view that we can't, you know, our poor are so poor, they're so poorly fed that we're at risk of becoming weak. And I think what that moment in time reveals to us is that this concept of like disposable people, while we often point at kind of other geographies, that category very much applies in the United Kingdom also. And the ability to maintain disposable people in territories always runs the risk of blowing back, and it tends to upon you know, in cycles. And I think we're at a moment like that right now, right, where we've had the proliferation of food banks.
I blame the Normans for a lot.
We had the proliferation of food banks, food insecurity, increase in deaths from malnutrition. So even people who have enough food have the wrong food. Like, we're in this incredibly unique moment now where I think that blowback effect of allowing barbarity to proliferate always runs the risk of people within our own shores being categorised as such. So I think, you know, there is always that kind of sense of risk. With regards to like the how do you find out who pays who, right? It's complex. We were sat there kind of having lunch and kind of talking. Well, I wasn't eating because I was really stressed. But like, we were talking about our genealogies, and I think you know, all of us could identify ways in which our own histories had switched and crossed sides. And I think there is like this myth of racial purity, which I think undermines this understanding of reparations as being fundamentally risky to people, white people, people who see themselves as holding some forms of privilege at this time. In truth, many people from different backgrounds are categorised as disposable at some point or at some time. A focus on reparations says that we want to address those vulnerabilities. And yes, there are discussions about how we do that and which way we go first. But I think it's really important to make sure we understand, like, reparations' first step is to apply to our everyday life right now. Who around us is being devalued? What narratives are we supporting, which are enabling their continued oppression? And what structures of domination are we colluding in? That's reparations day one for all of us. That doesn't take anything. That question of, you know, whether or not we go and seize the Bearings farms is, you know, outside, to be quite frank, right now, and not really my concern. That's not what I'm worried about per se. Others might be.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, on this question of like, how do we speak to people who maybe, the reason why this conversation is uncomfortable is like they get the sense that they've benefited from these unequal power dynamics. And all of us have in some ways, you know, like we're talking about race here, but as you said, like disposable people and territories, that happens along many lines: race, gender, class, sexuality. And as an organizing principles, that thing about reparations is just like, how do we repair any harm, really? And so it's acknowledging the depth of harm that's happened to various communities, and on how do we speak to people who maybe have benefited from it in various ways. I think it's reminding ourselves that learning about it and finding ways of redistributing that power can be healing and very rehumanizing, because it's reconnecting with the fact that having a different skin color never made you a better person in the first place, you know, and that what makes the most precious thing that you hold is actually, it's nothing to do with your race. It's like, I don't know, it might have something to do with your spirit, your heart, your ability to use your agency in this lifetime to do something that you think is aligned with goodness and your values and God for some people. And I think that's what we need to be able to talk about, the fact that it's not just like, okay, like, I don't know, just like, terrible time for white people or anybody who holds privilege. It can be also an incredibly healing time, I think, to reconnect with the fact that our humanity, you know, and should not be connected to the sense of feeling superior to anybody, and the unlearning is healing, you know?
Hugely rich responses. Tom, and then we're going to take a question from the online crew.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, I grew up in the industrial north of England, as I mentioned, and you know, it's now called the Red Wall, but I got involved in what have recently been called citizen assemblies, so I don't want to be seen as being down on them as a way of opening up these sorts of conversations, which I was lucky enough to be able to do in industrial town not far from where I grew up. And so we had this thing which we call the citizens jury, you can call it all sorts of things, and they were people who had been invited from the local community to address an issue they chose, and it included people who'd been leafleting for the British National Party. And it was so fascinating talking to them. Like, they looked like me, we were both white, I was like slightly older than some of them, slightly younger than others of them. But it was a citizens' jury that drew from the communities of this town that was quite racially divided by a big dual carriageway. So people were coming from either side, they're sitting in the citizens' jury. And at the beginning, one guy who I kept in touch with for many years afterwards said, well, we ended up dealing with the problem of drug-related property crime and alcohol-related violence. And he said, well, the problem with this problem just can be solved by bombing Afghanistan. So you just bomb Afghanistan, it's all sorted. By the end of it, he'd got to know people, he'd understood the different perspectives from different parts of the world. He was learning Urdu after like a few weeks of evenings coming into the local library for these discussions. And I do think the kind of othering of white communities who have, as Andre pointed out, like the factories that processed cotton that came from India were processed by children and horrifically oppressed white working class communities. So, you know, it's, I think the conversation and seeing that that's the beginning. I mean, this conversation, I hope, is the beginning, and I hope we can have sort of more informal conversations afterwards on the La Via Campesina platform. Nothing wrong with La Via Campesina.
Thank you. Any questions from colleagues online?
So there's a quick first one, just, is there any way we can listen to the songs again?
Hey, good question.
Thank you, I appreciate that. I have one last song for you, actually, for those who... yeah, so I will sing one last song. One of the songs is already online. They're on Spotify and all streaming platforms. There's 2 EPs online, Sound Capsule for Grieving and Sound Capsule for Loving. And I'm now working on Sound Capsule for the Revolution. So some of the songs today are from that third one. And so if you follow me on like Spotify or on Instagram, then you'll know when that comes out. And my Instagram is Laurie Music. So, yeah.
Do you want to just spell that for people?
Yeah. LaurieMusic. Laurie music.
Okay. And it will be incentive to stay to the very end because Laurie will perform her last track for us as we close. Can I go back to the floor here for a question? Okay, in the green jackets and glasses, yeah?
There's a microphone coming.
Thank you. It's difficult to answer a question, really, amongst all of this. It's so deep and broad and everything. I work with a lot of farmers, and there is a lot of othering going on in that community. And I say that community, it's not homogenous by any means. And one of the issues, I work in the organic sector. I came originally from cooperatives and permaculture, but we hear this term, oh, farmers are this, farmers are that. To me, they're all, well, I know we certify 1,500 organic farmers. I know quite a lot of them. I think of them in, well, this one is up a hill here, this one's doing this over there. One of the things that a lot of our farmers have in common, not all of them, is a desire to work at the routes to market is the official term, but it's about that community interaction of selling the food to somebody you look at rather than just on to a supermarket buyer and then complain about the price you get from the supermarket. And so it's, I think, I don't know what the question is, but how food is devalued and how our interaction with food is devalued. And although the sugar and the cotton are scary to a lot of people, I mean, I have read about some of the activities during the slave trade. I had to stop because it was too much. But to then find a way to engineer or get an entrance into that conversation to say people, we can stop othering. It does work. But I don't know necessarily, there isn't going to be a one-size-fits-all to that, I suppose, is what I'm saying. And how we have those conversations. Tom's bit about the ORFC and the origins of the soil association was very interesting, although I would suggest not all organic people come from a fascist background.
Yeah.
So maybe Andre and then Laurie, if you wanted to come in. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I think this one is Tim Lang in Feeding Britain, I think, who really clearly articulates that the roots of Britain's food policy, current food policy, where we operate with production deficit, has its roots in empire and essentially has functioned off the basis of food being produced cheaply elsewhere in disposable communities and with disposable territories. And so I think this, like, for me, it doesn't feel like a diversion from the analysis. It feels like another example, one that we need to, really do more to explore and to figure out and to include farmers in that exploration, not just, tell them facts, but allow that journey of discovery. Ultimately, as long as food is able to be produced unfairly abroad, and the UK has access to that food and can continue to import it at a reduced rate, I think British farmers are going to really struggle because that's kind of same dynamic of using food production elsewhere to drive down prices. So it's a dynamic, and I think process is really important to allow people to get on board, to not feel alienated and excluded. But ultimately, there are narratives that need to be confronted.
Okay, we're running short on time. What I might do is just check to see if there are any other questions from people online.
There's one more. How can we include seeding reparations into our food policy framework so that our actions truly serve people in our communities for unpaid work?
For? Unpaid work.
Unpaid work.
Tom or Lauren, is that picking your attention?
It's quite a big question.
Could you repeat the question, Morgan?
How can we include seeding reparations into our food policy framework so that our actions truly serve people in our communities for unpaid work?
Okay.
I mean, what I was thinking in response to your question might connect to that in some way. You were asking you know, that sense of like, how do we stop othering, and how do we, that was one of your questions, like, how do we start acknowledging that, like, not othering works? And also, you were talking about the pain of like having food and the labor that goes into growing food being constantly devalued and having to navigate that environment. And I feel like where that takes my mind is like, we need to remember that the othering between like different people and the othering of like people of color and migrants is historically connected to the othering that we've done with nature. Like that's where it all starts, this sense that like we are separate from nature, we need to engineer nature, we need to like work it out, study it, figure out how to like extract value from it for our own benefit as humans, and this is how it will go. And like within that, historically, there's been an exploitation of both like natural resources and devaluing of the intimacy that you can have with like with nature, with the food that you grow, and at the same time like people and bodies were like also dehumanized in the process. And I guess like seeding reparations, you know, how to include it, I guess we need to keep thinking about it, and a way of making these connections that I think might help is just remembering that reparations is also like healing that separation between like our sense of self, you know, and what is the other, and how we've included nature in the other, and like starting to really connect these things, and understanding that, yeah, like as a result, anti-racism and rehumanizing people of color, as well as like starting to really understand the sacredness that lies in nature, and therefore in like the very ways in which we can produce food, you know, is the only way we get there. We need that shift in paradigm.
Yeah, excellent points. Tom, can you come in?
Yeah. I mean, at etc. we work day in, day out in close contact with farmers, with the global food sovereignty movement. La Via Campesina is one of the organisations we work very closely with, and that, you know, is millions of farmers, tens of millions, if not more. And in the UK, you know, the strides made towards the very issues we've been bringing up by groups like Land Workers Alliance, and I think organic farmers and growers and all sorts are part of this. I do think Brexit has been a really interesting time, thinking of who have been guests here in the last few years and who are guests here this year. Maybe we're on a good path in the UK. In the Netherlands, by contrast, I don't know if any of you have followed the tractor protests there. They are following, and you know, I don't think we're in any sense immune from it, a blood and soil narrative of you know, Dutch farmers, the indigenous Dutch farmers need to take over. So I think we have to constantly be aware. And you know, as for the Soil Association, I've worked with people in the Soil Association for many years. I don't think any of them are proud of what happened up until the 1960s. I just wish that as a child growing up in the 70s and 80s, and a bit more openness about those origins, which I think, you know, is the environmental movement. I mean, I didn't get to Germany and the history of Steiner and racial hierarchies and Waldorf schools, and you know, there's lots going on that we need to be aware of.
So I'm going to come to Andre and then maybe try and sneak in one last question, because they're so good and they're coming thick and fast before we have our close song. So, Andre.
So I think, you know, the structural domination bit of that triangle, I think has been hard to squeeze in because there's so much to talk about here. But I think the solution to that, in my eyes, is plurality. It's about how do we develop systems of exchange and value, of working with each other, of working in relationship to the land, which have, you know, full space to develop a kind of different route, a different way of doing things. For me, this question about unpaid work, I think there's a few things. You know, the very basic one is like consent, is like having a conversation and talking to whoever the people who are doing unpaid work is. But I think the second bit is that, you know, once that relationship is established, there's space to begin really experimenting with the ways in which our relationships can become more reciprocal. And I think, you know, in this country in particular, for a number of years, there's been a real hunger for people to re-engage in kind of Black history and to reanalyze the colonial legacy. And so while, you know, every organisation can't pay everybody who's a part of their work, there are different ways of entering a reciprocal relationship, in particular in working to surface hidden narratives and recognise their communities and the impact that our current system of production has had historically on them. And I would invite everybody to really, you know, think about reparations as an opportunity to experiment and to diverge and be in dialogue with people. It's not that there's like millions of blueprints for this, unfortunately. But yeah, let's work on plurality, and let's take this kind of risk of not being able to pay everyone and turn it into an opportunity to think about different ways of being together.
We are very close to time. I'm going to take the last question from you in the white shirt, please. Yes.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone on the panel. It's been like such a fantastic conversation to witness. I was just wondering, what do you think is the most effective way of kind of dismantling those power structures and those kind of systems of oppression that we see kind of running rife throughout the industrial food chain, but I guess, yeah, more specifically in the UK, and yeah, as the title of this kind of talk is, like making the big UK food corporations pay, like how do we go about doing that as effectively as we can to kind of achieve, yeah, environmental and social justice?
Anybody keen to
Sure, I can
jump in?
Yeah.
Yeah, Laurie.
I feel like with any sort of organizing and big issues, like we got to start where we're at. You know, what do we have access to? Who are the people that we speak to? What organizations are we part of? I feel like there's something really beautiful in finding like our own unique contribution to any given topic, and like the contribution that make us feel like alive and whole, and like, you know, there's so many different ways of going at it, and I think different people will have to go at it from different ways. In terms of like, you know, to be able to attack these corporations, I think we really need like, we need alliances, we need organizing, and that is slow. But I think, yeah, I'm thinking about all of there's something about community power and like people who are able to embody alternatives, but also like reaching out to, I guess, actors who will have the tools to connect with, okay, like we're gonna try and hold Parliament accountable, we're gonna like work with the press, we're gonna like organize a campaign, we're gonna work with like, I don't know, people in other countries who are like attacking the same corporations in another way. And I think that process of just figuring it out can be incredibly, you know, like difficult, but also incredibly like enlivening and powerful. So I don't really have an answer on like what's the best way, but I guess something about like not worrying too much about like having the right way or having it all sorted, but like getting really invested in like the trying and yeah, and what we learn along the way.
So maybe Tom and Andre both take a shot at this as maybe your last few words.
So thanks everybody for sticking to the end. I've really enjoyed it. The example I just wanted to give, like anybody can think of their nearest football ground. I guess the bigger the football ground, the better. Many of them have campaigns organised by football fans against food poverty. So Andre mentioned food banks. These are saying, we're not for opening up a food bank in our football ground. We want to tackle food poverty. And the link to football, I think certainly cities like Liverpool has been really powerful. And that links to a right to food campaign, which I know there's been legislation attempted in Scotland. In India, there was pioneering legislation. Now Lula's back, that could gain traction in Brazil. And that opens up the right to food. Then the question is, what kind of food? So I think that is a really useful way forward. And in connection with that, I personally don't think we're going to get any of that from our present government in the UK. So I really think everybody at the ORFC that can starts talking to their closest or the person they can contact in opposition parties, because believe me, knowing some stuff from the inside, there are lots of forces, some of the billionaires I've mentioned, who have the direct line of some of the leaders of these parties, and if we don't intervene, then they'll make some horrible mistakes.
And for me, I think it's the narratives. You know, if I look at that, what's the easiest way to put out that fire? The narratives. You know, none of them are easy, but we do have an infinite capacity to tell stories and tell them well. And I think we really need to like lean into that narrative power that we have as a collection of people and as individuals. You know, the industrial food system gets away with a hell of a lot by you know, this kind of tacit understanding that it is the best or most effective way of feeding people globally. But, you know, during the British Raj, you know, 30 million people died of starvation. That never happened before, and I don't think it's happened after, since. And so actually, when you, and that's just one territory, right? When you look at it, really there is a giant myth that we're all kind of living with and sitting under, that the industrial food system is the most effective at feeding the nation, or feeding nations, or feeding the world. And in fact, etc. have that wonderful statistic, which Tom was...
70% of the world's population is fed by smallholder farmers. That was research I can't take credit for, but Grain and etc. produced it, and we're in the 3rd edition of Who Will Feed Us, which is you can get on our website.
70% of the world. So I think, start with narratives. Let's shift that. Let's start telling the actual stories, the real ones, and I think we'll do that. And I understand the sense of rush, but my cautionary kind of words would be that, you know, for 400 years now, various people in various languages have been saying, "Don't do this," and you know. And now suddenly, you know, it's like, oh, those really is the last moment. And it's like, oh, still don't listen to those. Like, I think, let's do it properly. Maybe I'm too much of a brinksman, but I just think that ultimately that sense of urgency plays into the industrialist hands. Yeah. It says that they're the ones, because of their scale, that can save us, and that's not correct. Yeah. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
So much fun.
So we're going to give our last word to Laurie, who's going to play us out. I'd like to thank you all as an audience, thank you all to the panellists, and please do mingle and ask some questions. I'm not going to sum up, I'm going to allow Laurie to take the stage.
Thank you. This song is called En nous lever, and it speaks to tapping into the rebellious energy inside of us, understanding that what is required of us in this moment is the unthinkable for many of us, and that it's been done before, and channeling that ancestral energy of resistance to face what is the context that we're in today. So yeah, it's called En nous lever.
Sont là mes ancêtres, et le tambourine cogne par les cellules et les portes de la peau, que la source a fait miel, réceptacle solennel d'un bouquet tonnerre, Dieu, conjugaison luminaire qui trouve les chemins de ma gorge, par les os et les muscles, par les fleuves et les blessures, les frissons, les vagues à l'âme de mon tronc frémissant, ouais. Je sens les flèches et le sang qui me montent dans le dos, trombe brûlante et décisive. Cette force, j'irai juste, qui dans mon être, vers la révolte, qui dans mon être, vers la révolte, vers la révolte, vers la révolte, sous mon point France. Croissant dans sa nouillée, tous ancêtres sont nous qui vivent. Songez, oh, songez, oh, songez, oh. Nous peuvent avancer un chemin. Nous cessons de halater. Les chemins en nous, c'est lumière. C'est même si fait qu'à chauffer ciel. Qui fait trembler Babylone. Oh, yeah, oh, yeah, oh, yeah, oh, yeah, oh, yeah. Let us find strength strength in what we are. The ancestors who fought so we could walk this path. Remember them, all of them, honor them. Let us channel their requiems. We are soldiers of the earth, stepping back into the light. It's the same heat warming up your heart that will burn down Babylon, that will burn down Babylon. Let us find strength, strength, strength in what we are. The ancestors who fought so we could walk this path. Remember them, all of them, honor them. Let us channel their requiems. We are soldiers of the earth, stepping back into the light. It's the same heat warming up your heart that will burn down Babylon.
So once again, I'd like to thank Laurie, Tom, Andre. I would also like to thank the technicians and the volunteers that have helped us run the session.
Big clap for Natalie!
Have a safe journey home.